And today we're going to talk about food and hunger. And more specifically, when we think about hunger, how do we mean in the context of the environment? And how has this been exacerbated by COVID over almost the last 2 years? And how do we reimagine some of those solutions to hunger? Now, this is not a new concept by any stretch of the imagination. This has been around for decades. And we've struggled on how do we make sure that we feed all of us in a healthy and nutritious way. But I guess a good place to start would be defining what we mean by hunger. Now, the UN's hunger report defines the term as periods when a population experiences severe food insecurity, meaning they go for entire days without eating due to a lack of money, a lack of access to food or other resources. And one of the big problems here is actually that we create enough food globally. Around 125% of the food that we need is created every year. Yet 10% of the world's population go to bed hungry every night. So maybe this is just an unequal distribution problem. Maybe it's not about being able to produce enough, but getting it into the hands and the mouths of those that need it. However, like all complex problems, the solution is never that simple. Our friends at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation talk about how 1/3 of all food is wasted before it reaches our plate. And when we spend $1 in the store, it actually equates to $2 when we take into account the externalities of health and environment. Now, of course, hunger is strongly interconnected with poverty, and it involves interactions among an array of social, political, demographic, and societal factors. So let's get into today's conversation. Before I introduce the guests, however, a little bit more about how you can get involved in the session today. Unfortunately, for now, you can only see my face, and you're only going to be able to see the face of our guests today. But you do have the option to put questions into the panel today as the conversation develops. So if you want to ask a question, do use the Q&A function, and I'll come back to that during the course of the conversation to make sure we put those to the panelists. And you've been warned, if you don't ask questions, I will. And we may end up down a whole manner of different rabbit holes. So get them in early, get them in as the conversation develops to be part of the discussion today. So we've got a real treat for you today. I was going to set up by saying we've got folks across three different time zones, but actually 2 time zones. So Scott is actually in London today. Firstly, we have Scott Mather. Scott is the CIO and Core and Sustainability Investments at PIMCO. He's the Managing Director of the Newport Beach office and a member of the Investment Committee and Generalist Portfolio Manager, and has almost 30 years of experience in the investment space. He also oversees the firm's global ESG portfolio integration and sustainable investment activities. Secondly, and by no means any less important, is Lisa New. Lisa is President and CEO of the Global FoodBanking Network, has served as the Vice President of Global Agriculture at the Food at Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and has become one of the leading global contributors to the discussion around hunger and food security. Therefore, if nothing else, with these 2 panelists in the conversation today, we're in for a good ride. So enough of me, let's get into the conversation. Welcome to you both, Scott and Lisa.
Hello.
So Lisa, coming to you first then, and I'm going to remind you very quickly, you are currently on mute. Coming to you first of all, let's set the scene a little bit. What is the Global FoodBanking Network doing globally, and what is the reality of that we're seeing when we talk about food waste and food security?
Great, thanks, James, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining today. Pleasure to be here with all of you. So the Global FoodBanking Network, we are a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 2006, and our explicit purpose is to connect food recovery organizations to address hunger. We serve food banks, or these food recovery organizations, in 44 countries. And last year, each of these organizations played a vital role in improving food access in their community. Collectively, they diverted more than 790 million kilos of food and grocery product from landfill. And in the process of that, served more than 40 million people facing hunger in the places where they were based. One of the unique advantages of working through the food banking model, in the sense that it addresses both food loss and waste challenges as well as hunger challenges, but it also really seeks to build civil society and community. So these organizations are working with 60,000 social service agencies in their communities. And this is everything from schools to hospitals to job training centers to natural disaster responders, organizations that serve food, but in the process of that also meet other basic human needs, and many of them working to address the root causes of hunger. I'll just say a bit, because I know we'll get into this more, about the challenge really of food waste and hunger. But as people joining today may be well aware, in spite of the fact that our world produces more than enough food for everyone to have enough, due to a variety of issues, nearly a third of all of that food never reaches the plates or the cabinets of people. And that food production has a significant cost, not only economically, but also in terms of environmental concerns. In fact, the estimate is that the food loss and waste that is diverted every year accounts for about 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of this hunger challenge, and James, you really opened this up very well. Globally, we have two ways of looking at hunger. One is related to what you were talking about, and that's called prevalence of undernourishment. That is people that struggle daily to access enough calories to even meet their basic energy needs. And post-COVID pandemic, even though we're not in the post world yet, we're looking very sadly at approximately 720 to 811 million people struggling daily. Those people are really driven kind of into hunger due to conflict settings or due to abject poverty. The second measure that we look at, though, which is a household measure of hunger, is related to food insecurity. And that is people who may have to skip meals, may continually feel stress about food, but are still able to meet overall, over the long term, their general basic energy needs. But that has become a very significant problem. And today, about 2.37 billion people face food insecurity, which is more than 1 in 3 people worldwide. Alongside this, we have even more challenges in individuals and families being able to afford a nutritious diet. And that's estimated to be about 3 billion people don't have the means to afford the nutritious whole diet that they need to thrive, to prevent chronic diseases, to prevent malnutrition. So it's a bit of a dark situation, but I think there's real opportunity, which we'll discuss today. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, there's some staggering statistics. You led with 790 million kilos, 8% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's quite poignant given where we are in the calendar and what's going to happen in Glasgow in 7 days' time. Can we talk, just to stick with you just for a moment there, Lisa, can we talk a little bit more around how the pandemic has exacerbated this? I know this is not a new problem, but what has the last 18 months, almost 2 years now, and as you quite rightly pointed out, we're not out of that challenge yet. What has been acute in what you've seen through the Global Food Banking Network?
Absolutely. I mean, the most obvious piece is just that we've seen an incredible rise in demand for food relief. Initially, that was due to the lockdowns, to the unemployment that occurred. People weren't able to earn wages and therefore needed the support of food relief. But what we're seeing, and this is what the International Labor Organization has confirmed, that you still have about 1 billion people in the world that are under or unemployed as a result of this pandemic, which presents real pressures for accessing basic needs, including food. The other driver of that is that even though there are some places where social protection systems exist, you have 1 in 2 people worldwide that have no access to social protection, which means if they're going to rely they need those basic services, they're really turning to non-governmental actors, many of which are food banks, to meet that. The second piece is that food banks are unique in the sense that they're recovering surplus product, a wholesome edible surplus product for redistribution. And so they work with various ag and food producers along the supply chain to do so. And what we have seen is that certain segments of the supply chain have been incredibly pressurized through the COVID situation. And that has reduced the amount of food that is available for donation and recovery. And so although food banks have adapted, they're recovering from different segments of the supply chain now, we are continuing to struggle to access enough food to meet demand. And the third thing I'll just raise is that, the pandemic has been kind of top of mind for all of us, but there have been a number of other crises that have been occurring alongside it. I know today we're talking about climate. Certainly natural disasters have compounded the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been cyclones, bushfires, droughts. There was a plague that affected much of Eastern Africa and parts of South Asia last year. All of this has created additional pressures both on the ag and food supply chain, as well as made it difficult for people to access food.
Brilliant, thanks, Lisa. And there was a nice segue there, I think, as well, when we think about the economics of this. And I think that's quite a nice point to bring you and Scott to the conversation, because I can see very obviously the link here between Lisa's organization and the challenge around food. But what is the role of someone like PIMCO plays here? Why is this something that an asset manager would want to focus on?
Well, listening to Lisa there, I sometimes approach it from the opposite direction. How could we not, be involved in trying to do something about the crisis? And as a global organization, we do feel that we have the responsibility to drive positive change in many different aspects. And that's, yes, it's through philanthropy, but it's also through volunteering. It's volunteering time, talent, and our advocacy in different ways. And thinking very innovatively and partnering with like-minded organizations like we do with Lisa and the Global Food Banking Network is really a way we view to magnify our impact. And obviously food and hunger is a humanitarian and human rights crisis, but it's also an economic crisis. And that's because hunger is not just about food, it's inextricably linked with many other problems. We know it's education, it's social justice, and economic opportunity. And it's also intertwined with other things like climate change and the environment. So it's really something that we feel, from a pure economic standpoint, is something that we all should be involved with and trying to address. And there's no doubt, as Lisa mentioned, that COVID created extra economic turbulence, if you will, and disrupted activity in so many places of the world that it made the hunger crisis that much more serious. It's also that combined with the changing weather patterns and challenges that we've had, the weaknesses in the supply chains that we've seen. So it's really disrupted, global food supply chains in new ways. And of course, as an asset manager, we care about the health of societies and economics. And many times, something I like to repeat is that, we definitely view that healthy societies, and healthy markets go hand in hand. And so that's why we've been committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, with a special focus on goal number 2, which is zero hunger. And we've had that as a focus of a lot of our activities for some period of time, but we really ramped it up in 2018, seeking really to look for ways to scale our impact through committing, once again, both our money, but our time and talent as well. And so we're very proud to be partnering with the Global Food Banking Network and other organizations as well. In 2020, I should note, PIMCO invested and donated close to 2.4 million to 15 charity partners, which led to over 3 million meals being distributed globally. So for us, it's an area where we know we and our partners are having a major impact, and one of the reasons we're advocating that as many people join us in this effort as possible.
Thanks, Scott. And it's interesting that we kind of touch on climate there. It feels that the kind of local impact, like as you mentioned, through volunteering and that sort of thing that PIMCO can have in this discussion is really important. But it also feels here as well that this becomes a macroeconomic consideration for you as an organisation, as we look at some of those challenges. Is this part of, is this almost part of looking at that longer term resilience, looking at that longer term risk at investments when we consider food and hunger as some of the influences on that?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at all 17 sustainable development goals, I mean, they're all overlapping and intertwined to some extent. But I always remind investors, and importantly, important for financial firms and investment managers like ourselves, that hunger and all the other related sustainability issues are really about making the world economy bigger than it would be otherwise, by making it more resilient than it would be otherwise. Right, and by making it more inclusive, and so it does have an impact, of course, on the medium and long-term outlook that we have with respect to economies and markets. So, just from the professional standpoint of what we do in the world of finance, it's very important to focus on.
Great stuff, thank you. And coming back to you, Lisa, then we've touched on this a little bit already, but keeping it kind of global for a moment before we sort of zoom in a bit to the local level. And coming back, the kind of topic or the motivation around this conversation today is a little bit around the sort of challenges we've seen through COVID. Can you talk a little bit to some of the global trends that you've seen through the network when we think about COVID?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The first thing that I will say, so most of our food banking partners are based in emerging and developing markets. So we're talking Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, a bit in East Asia. So places where you have very significantly limited government reach and government response. And so the first thing I want to say and acknowledge is that the private sector has largely powered the humanitarian response in our network, and I know that is true throughout the humanitarian sector. So for those of you that are joining today, and including our flagship partner being PIMCO, had it not been for the private sector stepping up and really playing an active role, food banks and then many other human services organizations would not have been able to facilitate the response that was needed. And so I can talk a little bit about what that means from a skill standpoint, but that's the first thing that I want to note. And I think for those of us working in agriculture and food, which is powered by the private sector, we really see companies as being an integral partner as we move forward. So I think, especially when it comes to thinking about what role is inflation going to play in the food markets, the ag and food markets, and how is that going to impact food banks' ability to access surplus product to, or purchase product to do recovery, how's it going to impact our clients' ability to access food, and what does that mean for demand? Those are all types of forces that we're taking into account as we look not just at the next year, but at the next 5 years and 10 years and things like that. So the first thing I want to say about the pandemic is the face of hunger has really changed. I think this is going to continue to happen because, especially, we saw a rise in the number of natural disasters that the network had to address last year alongside the pandemic. And that is causing a lot of migration in the network. And it's also affecting what food is available locally for food banks to recover. So, if we're thinking that natural disasters and climate change could displace as many as 1 billion people over the next 10, 20 years, where are those people going to go? What is that going to mean for wherever they're migrating? What is the economy? What services have to be in place related to that? The second thing I will note about the pandemic is it really forced our network to expand the number of partnerships they have with local agencies, because what people needed changed. And I think as we're thinking about what does the new economy look like? What does supporting families and individuals and getting back to work look like? How do we make sure that we're supporting health agencies that are addressing immunocompromised people or people that have unique health needs that may not be able to proceed in their lives as they did prior to the pandemic? Now we're living in this pandemic situation. So I think our strategy around how we engage with certain charities has changed, just because we want to support people from moving back to a place of self-sufficiency, which is everyone's desire, I think, in this circumstance. stance. So, so those issues, and of course, thinking about how are we going to get a reliable supply of food, the right types of food, diverse, culturally appropriate foods to meet demand over the next several years are things that I think are really weighing heavily on our minds and trends we've seen.
I mean, it's interesting, like behind all of these statistics are people, right? You know, they're individuals. And when you talk about, you know, kind of 1 billion people in terms of migration, I think it's UNICEF about 4 weeks ago now published a report saying that as a result of climate change, 1 billion children face negative impact over the next 10 years. So when you start talking of the magnitudes of those types of people, those aren't just folks in developing nations, it's also folks in developed nations as well. And this problem really is an equalizer when you look at some of the challenges and the numbers and the magnitude that we're facing. So we've skipped a little bit here around the kind of global picture, talking about the kind of macro trends and what we've seen. But I'd like to drill into that bit about the sort of local level. And this is a really good place to remind people to get their questions in. I'll keep talking and asking questions unless you put them in. So get into the Q&A function, ask your questions as we go, and we'll put those to both Scott and Lisa. But this is to both of you, and I guess it leans more to your point there, Lisa, but to both of you. When we look at some of these global meta trends around global hunger, climate change, biodiversity collapse, some of the challenges we're going to kind of see and feel over the coming years, how do you feel this is going to translate locally?
Translate,
Lisa, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you want me? Was that to me?
Yeah, it was. Sorry.
Sorry, I apologize. So no, I absolutely. I think you know, first of all, I think unless we take steps now to really think about how we're going to mitigate some of the risks, we are really going to be in a situation that is going to be difficult to navigate out of. And so by that, some of the things I'm thinking about is how do we work with key producers in the ag and food space to really understand how climate change is going to be affecting kind of food supplies, right? We know that we're going to have hotter weather, there's going to be more drought, more rains. You know, I think the issue of pests is really a significant deal. And then you have all the transportation issues that come with that. So one thing that we're beginning to think about, especially with our members, is where are you sourcing from now, and how do we anticipate that that's going to change over the next 5 to 10 years, so they can be building out the recovery infrastructure needed to ensure we're getting the right types of foods, and again, culturally appropriate foods. The second thing is absolutely, I think there's going to be a significant amount of migration. And so there's places, very populated places, especially in South Asia and Southeast Asia, where, you have as much as 50% of the population that is going to be at risk of being adversely affected by climate change. So we have food banks in some of those areas. So how do those food banks need to adopt their operations to be able to respond? What types of partnerships do they need to be able to facilitate that response? And then, a big part of what we're doing as an organization is we exist really to support entrepreneurs and local leaders that want to start new food recovery organizations. Since the pandemic has began, we've received more than 100 inquiries to give you a sense of the demand for service that we're seeing. But we really, need to, want to be strategic about thinking about what communities are going to be really at risk in the future, and how can we be supporting, organizations there and building out their resilience. So I think those are some of the things that we're really considering. The other point that I want to make, and I'm sure Scott will talk about this, is that the agriculture and food supply chain is the world's largest employer. It's over 1 billion people are involved in the supply chain. And a lot of those people are women and girls. And a lot of people face chronic hunger. James, the type of hunger that you were talking about, they're either subsistence farmers that don't have the productivity and the assets, the assets they need to make productivity gains, or they're working at some point along that supply chain. We're going to see, I think, a lot of movement in this system, over the next several years. So I think thinking about how do we make this more equitable and for people working in that system, so we don't have this great irony of some of the world's food producers also being those that are at greatest risk of hunger.
Yeah, it's a really, really, really complex and interesting point. Over to you, Scott, as well. Around that same sort of topic, any sort of elements you have there?
Well, yeah, I think, so the way we're thinking about it is obviously, it's a huge, tremendous global problem, likely, unfortunately, to face growing challenges because of the reasons that we just cited. And it often feeds on itself, as Lisa mentioned, in terms of developing, social unrest. So it's not even it's an individual crisis for sure. At the basic level, but it really is something that can spill over into many other areas and aggravate all sorts of problems, humanitarian problems, and cause political instability, cause migration issues, right? So those things really begin to compound. So our approach has been to say, well, let's think about what we can do on the global stage. The work that food banks do is tremendously important. It's important that they find ways to grow, to become even more self-sufficient and also more sustainable in their activities. And so that's why there's opportunities to do some new innovative things, and partnering with the Global Food Banking Network and PYXERA, for instance, we're launching, along with some other corporate sponsors, a program to kick off at the beginning of the year to reimagine greener solutions for hunger. And working through on a cross-corporate basis, coming up with new ideas on how we can not only make the network more powerful, serve more people, prepare it for the future, but do so in a greener way.
Brilliant. Staying with you for a moment then, Scott, on that as well, we talked about kind of the market forces, but geopolitical. One of the things that's quite acute at the moment in the UK is inflation and pricing. Can we talk a little bit about food pricing and how a number of these factors we discussed are going to impact in the short to medium term? And potentially then what do we do to mitigate that, right? Whether it be big fiscal measures or what we do as individuals. So I'll start with you there first, Scott.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one report from the UN cited that, on average, food prices were up something on the order of 30% during the last year, if you look at the average for most of humanity. And of course, that was compounded by, all the weather problems that we had, but and extreme weather events. And that's something that we have to worry about in the future, becoming a bigger and bigger problem. But it was also, of course, COVID interrupting the supply chain. But in many different ways, it's spilled into it. If you look at the factors and look at energy prices and prices for fertilizers in many countries, et cetera, right? It all worked to increase the costliness of food. And that's why, looking at ways when, as Lisa mentioned, you can get the right food at the right places at the right time and in an efficient way is really going to become much more critical. I mean, it would seem to us that, we're going to have, kind of a bumpy ride, if you will, when you think about the overlapping forces related to climate change that really compounds these episodes that we'll have of rising food inflation and shortages of critical components in the supply chain to even distribute food in an efficient manner. So that's probably, unfortunately, with us to stay, but that's why thinking innovatively about these solutions is really critical right now, and thinking about where we need to be 5 years from now and 10 years from now as some of these compounding effects begin to build.
Yeah, excellent. Lisa, anything you would build on that?
And I think, I think Scott's exactly right. And of course, Scott, you're so much better placed to speak on inflation, future trends, things like that, and what we can be expecting to see. I think the one positive I want to highlight is we have an incredible opportunity as it relates to our current production system, right? Even if we're going to see that the 1 to 2 to 3% decrease in ag productivity due to climate change, let's say that's a worst case scenario, which who knows how likely that is, depends on our actions. But even if you see that, like you said, James, at the beginning, we are producing plenty of food. This is a logistics issue. So I think part of what I think is exciting about this partnership with PIMCO, this project specifically that we're talking about today that I know will be carried out, is how do we think about, capturing that food and redirecting it to people in need, preventing, obviously, food loss and waste is first priority, but then for what can't be prevented, how can that be recovered? We saw so many encouraging things from food banks throughout this pandemic. I'll give one specific example. About 3 years ago, there was a food bank launched in Nairobi, and it was one of the first food banks in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa. And they have been able to exponentially increase service delivery during the pandemic because they teamed up with the export producers. And what they're finding is, in Kenya, they're producing a lot of fruit and veg for export, but cosmetically, a lot of what is being produced, although perfectly edible, wholesome surplus, does not meet the cosmetic standards for the European market. And so what we've seen, though, is through that partnership is FoodBanking Kenya has been able to recover a significant amount of very high demand product, fruit and veg, highly nutritious, significantly increase their service delivery through that partnership. So I think there's a great opportunity on the food loss and waste front from a human perspective, and there is a carbon neutralizing effect through that. We did a calculation a couple of years ago and looked at food banks in 60 countries to see what was the carbon footprint of all the food they were diverting from landfill. And what we found is that at least in 2019, there were 12.39 billion kilos of greenhouse gas emissions mitigated through food banks, which is the equivalent of about 2.9 million passenger vehicles from the road. And although I think that's significant to a small extent, it amounts to less than 1% of all food that is lost and wasted being recovered. So I think what that indicates to me is there is a tremendous opportunity here from a carbon standpoint, from a human need standpoint, without having to increase food production at all.
It's interesting, isn't it, that when you boil it down to a logistics issue, or potentially a logistics or a distribution issue, that one of the key factors here is probably time. And that actually to get that food in its nutritious state to others is very much dependent on having access to it and being able to distribute it where it is. And just harking back to the sort of 8% of greenhouse gas emissions, I mean, that is substantial when you look at it through the lens of carbon or carbon equivalent. Scott, we've kind of discussed now quite a lot of the some of the big economic factors here, but what about more around beyond that? Why is this important to PIMCO? You mentioned volunteering at the top of the conversation, but can you talk a little bit more about that beyond the economics, why this is important to PIMCO?
Yeah, we as I mentioned, besides the economics, I mean, we just see the ability to have an impact, and like our employees are excited about the programs, the opportunities that we provide them, connected to hunger. There's, as you mentioned, there's problems in all the places that we live and work, and so it's important. We've always felt, act locally and still, have a big picture and contribute as much as we can on the global stage. But, really it starts at home. I mean, the problems around us, it's going to, it certainly impacts the current generation. It impacts the future generation. The future generation are our future employees. The future generation are our future clients. And so, the ability to have an impact locally as well as on the global stage is really important in the activities that we conduct. And, just last year alone, we had over 2,000 employees contribute thousands and thousands of hours directed towards our hunger initiatives. And so it's something we believe strongly in, certainly from the humanitarian perspective, but also from the local perspective as well, in terms of what we can do for our communities, and also encourage others to join us, right? I mean, part of showing leadership in these areas is the ability to magnify impact, because people see you being involved in what you're contributing to the effort, and they too want to contribute. And so that's something that we're very proud of, and is one of the reasons why I think our employees are proud to be connected with PIMCO and its activities in so many different areas. We're noted for many years in a row as one of the top 50 most civic-minded organizations in the U.S., and that's something that we're all very proud of. So, I think our contributions in the area will just keep growing.
I like that, Scott, that impact doesn't just have to be financial. It can also be driven by time and effort and hours. With the questions are coming in thick and fast, I'm going to deviate slightly and just pull one out because, and this is from George, and this is something that I've kind of thought about before, that we should treat food almost like medicine, as in, food is our perspective on how we view food, should potentially be different. And he asks, it seems as there's even more stress everywhere and that more nutritious diets are needed to stay healthy. Is this the right assessment? And I'll put that to the floor.
I would absolutely say yes on that. If we even want to remove the pandemic situation, I mean, the top health risk globally is non-communicable diseases, which are driven predominantly due to diet. At the same time, we have a undernutrition crisis, most concerning, of course, being childhood undernutrition manifested through stunting. You have something like 1 in 4 children worldwide facing these stunting issues, but at the same time, we have a significant challenge related to overweight and obesity. And what's hard about that is that sometimes people that are facing that particular issue are also undernourished. And so you have this dual burden of malnutrition occurring. So I think it's about exactly right that we have to be thinking not just about, are you getting enough calories, but do you have access to the right dietary diversity? Are those foods culturally appropriate? Are they available? And how do you kind of layer that into, a lot of, people that are facing food insecurity live very, very busy lives. They're working many jobs. There's long hours involved. I mean, so convenience becomes a major factor here in behavior change. So these are very complicated issues, as Scott had said, with a lot of different intersections. But it's not just about making sure we have enough food. It's about the right foods, the culturally diverse foods.
Scott, is there anything you want to add there?
Well, no, I certainly in agreement with Lisa there. I mean, and I think the body of research that we continue to see on how important it is to not just focus on the nutritional quality. It's important for development in terms of what individuals can hope to achieve and what they can contribute to society. And so from that perspective, absolutely critical that there's a focus. Yes, it's not just food in aggregate, but the right types of food, in the right quantities in the right places. And so, that's why it's another element to what Lisa and the Global Food Banking Network think about, do, and help with, and another reason that we should all be supporting their activities.
I love that concept, actually, and this is coming up more and more in the narrative around when we think about nutritious and healthy food, looking at the types of nutrition and types of quality we want that food stuff to deliver, rather than the particular crop or the particular item that we might have used historically. And there's a lot of work going around that, especially in the retail space and in the sort of production of foods, where we look at properties rather than specific items, and hopefully that will continue. I want to shift now then to talk about a little bit around the work you guys are doing together, and actually the importance of partnerships. Now, you hear lots of people speak about collaboration and pre-competitive partnerships, but can we talk a little bit about the sort of practicalities through this initiative that starts in the new year, and how you find these partnerships developing now and what they need to look like as we move forward?
Sure, I'm happy to offer a few comments to start. Is that, so the partnership angle, right, which is the sustainable goal number 17, just realizes the impact of what working together can achieve. And we all have different things to bring to the table in terms of hunger and in terms of what we can hope to achieve. So, when we look at it, it's a very complex problem, and we sort of take a multi-dimensional approach to it. So it's through doing new, innovative things like reimagining greener solutions, the project that we talked about that we're kicking off towards the end of this year, beginning of next. But it's continuing to think about ways that we can have impact, and particularly, given we're in the financial markets, it's once again, it's not just what we're able to provide through our philanthropy efforts. Although, as Lisa mentioned, we're proud that we announced a 5-year, $10 million commitment to the Global Food Banking Network. It's not just those things. If you think also that other things we can contribute, it's the volunteer activities that we do. But let's think about the financial markets for a minute. There's a lot of things that we're doing there which are pretty innovative and we think can help considerably. I mean, some of those that I might mention would be the development of the sustainability linked bond market and loan market. Basically, we've been working with international organizations to develop those standards to really get that market going. This year, if you include the green bonds into the mix and all the sustainability linked bonds and loans, it's well over $1 trillion estimated that will be issued this year. So, just thinking about our advocacy there and what we can achieve by continuing to encourage the growth of that market. I mean, we're really talking about what would be a multi-trillion-dollar asset class, if you will, just in the course of a few years. That market's more than doubled in the course of 18 months. So, once again, something not everybody thinks about unless you're maybe in the financial markets, every day. But there's other ways, of course, that from our financial market perspective, that we can have a big impact. We're very happy at PIMCO to have the privilege to co-chair the UN Global Compact's Chief Financial Officer Task Force for the SDGs. So once again, it's building a network which the UN recently announced they hope to grow to hundreds, if not 1,000 companies globally, that will share knowledge with one another about how to have impact, how to create value for their organizations by carefully thinking about some of these sustainability issues and pushing their time thinking out in time. So it's not about always what you can get done in the next 3 months, but what can you do to add lasting change and build that resilience with everything to do with sustainability, and certainly hunger is at the center of that. So there's a lot of things like that goes back to my point of we each approach it from our own different angle and perspectives in terms of what we have and what we can offer. But the more that we can encourage people to do that from their own unique position, the better off the hungry will be, the better off the world will be. And so once again, a call to action for those who can join.
Thanks, guys. See, when you talk in terms of those sort of magnitudes of kind of figures of money available that this kind of problem can access, or at least the market is worth, it seems almost unthinkable that we'd be in a scenario where with those volumes of money, these challenges are still a challenge. I wonder then, where does the public sector factor into this? Where do our sort of governments, cities, municipalities, what is the role that they can do in enabling some of the deployment of the capital and some of the deployment of the activity? Lisa, in your work, what is the role that the public sector plays within the Global Food Bank network?
Yeah, so I think that the government, especially when it comes to how food is produced and how it moves, both in a local community, a national context, a global context, really plays a very important facilitation role. Specifically in the food recovery space, we have found that policy is one of the most important drivers of whether or not there is food recovered or food disposed of. And let me give you a few examples of that. I mean, there's a lot of places worldwide that just have policies that disincentivize food recovery. So for example, it's very necessary to provide liability protection for food donors. And if you're going to an accredited organization, you want to, if you're a food producer, you want to make sure that your food is handled safely, that it's going to get to the client. It's not going to be diverted on the black market. Certainly it wouldn't make anyone ill. And so there's only about 7 countries that have national laws in place that protect food donors from liability. For liability concerns. So that becomes a very discouraging factor if you have a company to charity trying to navigate that for obvious reasons of risk. The other thing is that tax incentives or disincentives play a role. If you don't have the right tax environment, especially if you're forcing food producers to pay VAT or some kind of tax on the food they're donating, that creates a real incentive to destroy the product or landfill the product, as opposed to donating it to people in need. need. So I think we have to think about those policy kind of levers from a regulatory standpoint as being quite important. And in fact, we have a whole project focused on analyzing national policy frameworks and thinking about how we can be supportive to food producers in navigating donation issues in those countries. The other thing I think, and this really gets into some of the great value we have found in the PIMCO partnership, is around how do we access some of this, like Scott was talking about, the financing that is here and that is going to be coming. And so I think what we've seen in other humanitarian sectors is creation of certain bonds related to social or environmental impact that are backed by certain governments. So I think there's a lot of discussion on how we use these tools in that. But I know a big issue, at least in our space, is around thinking about how do we quantify the carbon impact of food loss and waste. There's been incredible advancements, let's say in plastics. There's a really reputable kind of equation of how you quantify that. We haven't seen that done in the same way in food loss and waste, although there's a lot of players in there. But I think as kind of this movement to becoming more carbon neutral moves forward, you know, given the role food banks are playing or food recovery is playing in mitigating greenhouse gases, I think that's going to be an important piece, is how do you quantify that and how do you certify it in a way that potentially could play a role in some of these markets.
Yeah, and I would just add there, I mean, it's happening. It's refreshing to see. But when you look at, I mean, there's just been a dramatically changed, you know, focus from all elements of society on sustainability. And like you said, certainly everything with respect to climate, but a lot of the hunger issues, there's a lot of crossover with respect to what's occurring there and in climate. But you see, you know, for instance, if you just look at the number of especially large companies now that are focused on and trying to measure everything that they do in terms of what it contributes to sustainability issues. I mean, it's really just, it's been an explosive growth in that sort of disclosure and focus. And we think, you know, the more that happens, the more we'll have the ability to start addressing these problems. And, you know, when you think about it, you know, we've got a size of a global economy that's approaching the equivalent of $100 trillion, right? So when you think about, I mean, it's to this question, it's like, how can we still have some of these problems? Well, it's by not probably forming enough partnerships, you know, by not making all the problems as obvious and measuring them, quantifying them as much as we can. So that's it's important that that continues to develop. I mean, I've seen estimates that say, you know, to address all the sustainable development goals and put things on the right trajectory, right? What's needed is something on the order of $3 to $5 trillion annually. And of course, that sounds very daunting, but relative to a $100 trillion global economy, perhaps it's not so, you know, daunting after all. And when you just look at the role of corporates, you know, more broadly, right? They direct each year the equivalent of $15 trillion in investment. So once again, from the, you know, from the money perspective, it would seem, and from the economic perspective, there's the ability to do a lot to address some of these problems, but it starts with being able to measure things appropriately, and by making people well informed about, you know, the impact they're having both individually, you know, on the world and with respect to hunger and all the other related sustainability issues. You know, but also up and down the supply chains, you know, just being knowledgeable about, well, you know, this particular, you know, food item, how did it get here and what was involved in producing it, you know, and then thinking about those people that don't have access to certain, you know, certain food that everyone else takes for granted. But just being informed about that, starting to think about that is a powerful effect. You know, ultimately, all these things that have to do with this, you know, public sector, private sector, you know, partnership, if you will, which can be very powerful, you know, comes down to information, and ultimately, you know, the politics are very important in setting up those enabling frameworks that you talked about, Lisa, in terms of addressing the problem more powerfully. So, you know, the more there's both a groundswell of support from the average consumer, you know, and support from large companies and support from policymakers, you know, it all comes together to create more, you know, a much needed change at an exponential rate. So if, you know, on days when you're feeling really positive about the world and what you're accomplishing, I mean, you can, I sometimes try to reflect on that, just think about where the world was on some of these issues, you know, 5 years ago. And, you know, we look at our own advocacy and support for for trying to solve some of these vexing hunger problems. And it's also increased exponentially in the past several years in all the different ways that we approach the problem. So I think we can be somewhat positive and encouraged by the pace of change, although there's obviously some real daunting crisis challenges ahead.
Thanks, Scott. To bring a sort of positive tone to it, right? Because there is almost a sense of overwhelming, doom when we consider the magnitude of the challenge that we face. And I think to Lisa's point around the enabling conditions of policy, I think all of this is underlined very fundamentally by the idea of education. How do we understand? How do we fall in love with the problem and understand the impact we all have? And I wonder how much of this as well, from a sort of Western perspective, is also around behavior. The rise of the wonky vegetable, right? Which is happening, but it's still not mainstream. How do we fall in love with some of these elements that help us then tackle these huge mountains of waste? One of the areas we haven't really touched on much, and comes from Art in the question, is the role that technology plays. Now, I think I've got a reasonable handle on where that should fit in, but Lisa, when you're thinking about the food banking network infrastructure, what is the important role that technology plays now and what it can play in the future?
Sure. So I think, at least from the food banking perspective, what we have seen in the last 5 years on the tech front has been absolutely transformational, especially for the ability to identify where there is surplus in the system. So you've got a very complicated and long food supply chain, and opportunities to recover surplus all the way from production on farm to down to food service, a bit at consumer, but really stopping at food service. So what we have seen, especially in our emerging and developing market partners, and I just want to say for a minute, if you are living in the United States, in Canada, and Western Europe, if you think about food banks, you're probably thinking about bricks and mortar warehouses, giant trucks, almost like a very much so a counterpart to a private sector warehousing business. But once you start moving to emerging and developing markets where you just have a different economic base of philanthropic resources available to you, I think we've seen incredible innovation in the tech space as a result of this. So what we're seeing, in India, in South Africa, in Colombia, is technology to really help identify, give an early warning that there is surplus at certain points in the supply chain. You have to move very quickly because your surplus is not good for very long. It's not like, if you're doing in the, saleable sector, you might have weeks of shelf life. You really need to move that quite quickly. But then also using technology to link that surplus pickup or delivery with transport resources, and then directly with charity partners. And so we call this virtual food banking, which means it's not moving through your traditional truck warehouse distribution chain, but, in places I'm thinking about, for example, our member in Colombia, if you go into the north, into Medellin, and you want to do a traditional food banking model, you're driving 9 hours through hill country to pick up, your ag surplus, driving it back to Medellin and then redistributing it out into these rural areas. And it's just not necessary. So technology has enabled that food bank in particular to set up almost like a hub system where you have smaller charity partners picking up directly from producers, and that's all enabled through tech platforms. So we would say this is probably the fastest rising mechanism that our network is using to recover surplus product, and it makes product that is sensitive, requires cold storage, may only have a 48 to 72 hour shelf life before it has to be consumed. It makes it much more possible to recover those types of products.
I would think too. Yeah, I would think that's going to be a huge area of exploration, with those that companies that are joining us and you in terms of, trying to reimagine greener solutions for hunger, just the role of technology, just so transformational as you described. And, there's probably a lot of excellent ideas that are going to come out of this, this exercise that we're all going to participate in together. So looking forward to that. It'll usually be, the slightly younger generation that will come up with the most innovative ideas. So, I won't pretend to be contributing a lot of thoughts there myself.
And presumably, Scott, that is, the tech space is one of those areas that investment can really play a key role in. When we're looking at these new technologies and these new opportunities, that's when these sort of financing models and the bonds that you talked about before are really key to answering that question as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, remember, people are transforming their businesses, and many of the things they're doing with respect to sustainability, they're doing it for profit. We're talking about for-profit companies, but they're seeing a way to really use addressing sustainability issues and having a large impact on society. At the same time, they're finding ways to do that's very innovative, and certainly technology is a big part of that. Of course, people, they see the technology in terms of what it means in an easy way for things like energy efficiency and those technologies. But as Lisa was describing, I mean, just the amount of information that now can be collected so cheaply. And once again, it goes to really trying to address the bottlenecks with respect to global food banking. It's just going to be transformational, and no doubt in my mind, as we move through the next several years.
Amazing. Well, there you have it here. If you're a young, innovative tech entrepreneur in the food space, PIMCO on the hunt. I've got one question left for both of you. I can't believe we're 57 minutes in, which means we've got about 2-3 minutes left, and it's sort of rattled through. But I want to just future project for a moment, and apologies to the folks who've dropped questions in. We've got a lot of very interesting and meaty questions, and we'll try and answer those post event anyway. But if you could wave a magic wand tomorrow, and that's hypothetical for a moment, Lisa, what would be the biggest single impact you would want to see happen to help solve this challenge? And then Scott, I'll come to you as well.
This is such a tough question, James, because I feel like we're in that space where we're trying to work ourselves out of a job. And so I think that the most important thing we can do is think about how we bring equity to the food system for people that work within it, and then also making sure it can be as abundant as possible so food can be affordable. And that's a series of interventions that's working a lot to support women who are working in the food system, working a lot at places in the world that are, current hotspots that we may not think a lot about, like the sub-Saharan Africa locations, and in South Asia and Southeast Asia, places that are going to become more populated. And we're just going to see kind of the axis of influence globally shifting to those over the next 10 years. And so I just think if we can make sure that people have fair wages that are working in food, you're literally addressing employment again for 1 billion people. And then if you can think about how do we ensure the abundance of the food system so you can have the types of products that people need in the places they need at the price that is affordable, it would be transformational. So amazing.
And Scott?
Yeah, like Lisa said, it's a tough question to answer, I think, in a very simple way. But look, it's waving the magic wand would just be that that everyone, both individually and collectively, sees the crisis, understands it, and finds ways to make a difference individually. And once again, I go back to this idea. It's the power of partnership. And so, my call would be for, any individual or any of our corporate friends that are able to, join supporting the Global Food Banking Network and PYXERA and other organizations that are focused on hunger. Certainly a lot to do, but that's how big things get done, and continue to think innovatively about solutions. We talk about technology, but there's going to be all sorts of innovative ideas that are really going to make a difference.
Amazing. Well, Scott, Lisa, thank you very much for the last hour of your time and cantering through that very, very meaty topic. We've talked about, the magnitudes of the millions of kilos of food waste. We talked about greenhouse gas emissions. We talked about the micro and macroeconomic impacts and factors that we can and can't control. And also about the importance of, investment is really important, but also investing your time and the volunteerism that we see through this. If anyone wants to find out more about the greener solutions to hunger, visit PYXERAGlobal.org. The project launches towards the end of the year, and there'll be more information on the website you can find then. It just leaves me to say thank you to you at home, and thank you to those of you who interacted with the questions. I hope that's been an enjoyable canter through this challenge of food. Thank you once again to Scott and Lisa for your time, thank you to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening, and we look forward to speaking to you again very, very soon. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.